They told you the First World War started in 1914. That's what every textbook says. That's what every history class teaches. One assassination, one archduke, one bullet. And suddenly the modern world was baptized in fire. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Europe had already done this before. Not a preview, not a rehearsal. A full, merciless, continent-wide catastrophe that made the trenches of the Somme look like a neighborhood dispute. It happened 300 years earlier. It burned for 30 years straight. And by the time it was over, entire regions of Central Europe had lost a third of their people. Some places lost half. Villages didn't just get burned, they disappeared from maps entirely, as if God had reached down and simply erased them. This was the 30 Years' War, and almost nobody in America talks about it. It started as a religious conflict, Catholics versus Protestants, the old faith against the new. That's the clean version, the version that fits on a test. But the real story is something far darker and far stranger. Because within a decade, Catholic France was bankrolling Protestant armies. Protestant princes were cutting deals with the Pope's allies. Mercenary soldiers were slaughtering the very populations they were supposedly defending, burning Lutheran villages in the name of Lutheran princes, torching Catholic towns under Catholic banners. The war ate its own justifications alive. It stopped being about God somewhere around year 6, and nobody ever told the soldiers. 30 years. An entire generation born into war, grew up in war, died in war, and never knew a single summer of peace. That's what we're diving into today. If you're new here, this channel is where history gets told the way it actually felt. Not the dates and treaties version, but the mud, the fire, the desperation, the impossible decisions, and the moments that changed everything. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming.
And drop a comment. I want to know where you're watching from. I'm always genuinely curious.
Now, let's go back to the early 1600s, to a continent that was sitting on a powder keg and didn't even know the match was already lit. Picture Europe in 1617. From the outside, it almost looks stable. The great religious wars of the previous century have supposedly been settled. There are treaties, there are agreements, there are carefully negotiated compromises that took decades to hammer out. Catholic and Protestant princes share the patchwork of the Holy Roman Empire, that vast, unwieldy collection of kingdoms, duchies, free cities, and bishoprics that stretched across the heart of the continent like a political fever dream. Hundreds of separate territories, each with its own ruler, its own laws, its own grudges, all technically under one emperor. The historian C.V. Wedgwood, whose monumental study of this war remains one of the finest ever written, called it a political monstrosity, a structure so complicated, so contradictory, that holding it together required constant, exhausting negotiation between forces that fundamentally despised each other. And underneath that surface calm, underneath the treaties and the diplomatic courtesies, the ground was shaking. The Peace of Augsburg, signed back in 1555, had tried to resolve the Protestant-Catholic split with a simple, brutal rule. The prince decides. Whatever faith the ruler of a territory chose, that became the faith of everyone living there. Cuius regio, eius religio. Whose realm, his religion. On paper, it sounded like a solution. In practice, it created a continent-wide, slow-motion civil war, because the map kept changing. Rulers died, territories shifted hands, Protestant bishoprics got absorbed by Catholic powers, and vice versa. Every inheritance dispute, every succession crisis, every death of a childless prince became a potential religious flashpoint.
And there was something else the Peace of Augsburg hadn't accounted for.
It only recognized two faiths, Catholicism and Lutheranism. But by the early 1600s, a third force had exploded across the continent: Calvinism. The faith of John Calvin, with its fierce doctrine, its iron discipline, its vision of an elect chosen by God before birth. Calvinist communities had sprung up across France, the Netherlands, parts of Germany, Scotland, England. They were fervent, organized, and completely unrecognized by the legal framework that was supposed to keep the peace. From the Catholic perspective, Calvinists were heretics who didn't even have the grudging legal protection that Lutherans had managed to win. From the Calvinist perspective, the entire existing order was an offense to God. Neither side had any incentive to compromise. Meanwhile, the Habsburgs, the dynasty that ruled both the Holy Roman Empire and the sprawling Spanish Empire, had been quietly, patiently, methodically working to roll back the Protestant gains of the previous century. The Counter-Reformation was in full swing. Jesuit missionaries were moving through Protestant territories, reconverting communities, pressuring local rulers, establishing Catholic schools and churches in regions that had been Lutheran for 2 or 3 generations. The Catholic Church was not retreating. It was advancing. And Protestant princes were watching that advance with cold, controlled terror. Then there was the money. Always the money. The Holy Roman Empire was also an economic battlefield. The great trading cities of southern Germany, Augsburg, Nuremberg, Frankfurt, were mostly Protestant. The powerful Hanseatic League ports to the north were Protestant. The Catholic South and the Habsburg heartland needed access to those trade networks. And Protestant princes controlled vast church lands that they'd seized during the Reformation, lands that the Catholic Church very much wanted back. Every theological dispute was also a property dispute. Every argument about the nature of grace was also an argument about who owned the monastery, the mill, the forest, the grain stores. So when people say the 30 Years' War was about religion, they're right. And when people say it was really about politics and money and dynasty, they're also right. That's what made it so impossible to end. You couldn't negotiate away the theology without surrendering the property. You couldn't surrender the property without undermining the political power, and you couldn't touch the political power without threatening the entire imperial structure. Everything was connected to everything else, and it had been building, pressure compounding on pressure, for decades. All it needed was one moment, one incident, one act of confrontation that was dramatic enough, public enough, outrageous enough to shatter the fiction that peace was still possible. That moment came on a clear May morning in Prague in 1618, and it involved 3 men, a window, and a fall that would become the most argued-over incident of the entire war's opening chapter. Prague in 1618 is a city crackling with tension. Bohemia, the kingdom that covers roughly what we now call the Czech Republic, has been a flashpoint for 100 years. This is the land of Jan Hus, the reformer burned at the stake 2 centuries earlier, the man who arguably started the whole Protestant movement before Luther was born. Bohemia has a strong Protestant majority. Most of the nobility, most of the townspeople, most of the farmers are Protestant, either Lutheran or Calvinist. But their new king, Ferdinand of Habsburg, is about as Catholic as it was possible to be in the early 17th century. Ferdinand had been educated by Jesuits. He had personally pledged, as a young man, to exterminate heresy from his lands. He meant it.
Not metaphorically.
He meant it literally. With the burning conviction of a man who believed that Protestant souls were headed for eternal damnation, and that the most loving thing he could do for them was to make sure they converted before they died. He had already begun rolling back Protestant rights in his other territories. Now Bohemia was watching, and Bohemia was terrified. The Protestant Bohemian nobility had tried to get guarantees from the Habsburgs. A document called the Letter of Majesty, issued by the previous emperor, that was supposed to protect their right to worship. But Ferdinand's representatives in Prague were making it very clear that those guarantees were negotiable. Protestant churches were being shut down. Royal officials were blocking Protestant assemblies. The message was unmistakable. The old deal was over. On the 23rd of May, 1618, a group of Protestant Bohemian nobles marched into Prague Castle. Not with an army, with fury and a legal complaint. They confronted the royal governors, men named Martinic and Slavata, and accused them of violating Bohemian rights. The confrontation escalated fast. Voices rose. Accusations flew across the stone-walled chamber. And then, in a moment that was partly planned and partly just the rage of the moment boiling over, the Protestants grabbed Martinic, grabbed Slavata, and threw them out the window. A third man, a royal secretary named Fabricius, was thrown out after them. Third floor. The window was roughly 50 feet above a dry moat filled with rubble and garbage. All three fell. And then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, Martinic and Slavata survived. Both men were found alive, battered but breathing. Fabricius's fate is murkier. Contemporary accounts differ on exactly what happened to him in the chaos that followed, though Catholic sources quickly claimed he, too, had walked away unharmed.
The Catholics immediately declared it a miracle. The hand of God had protected his servants. The Protestants immediately declared it a sign of divine judgment. Even God's own representatives couldn't govern Bohemia against its people's will. Both sides took the survival of the governors as confirmation that they were right, and that told you everything you needed to know about where this was going. The defenestration of Prague, that's what history calls it, defenestration being the gloriously specific Latin-derived word for throwing someone out of a window, was the spark. Within days, the Bohemian Protestant nobility had formed a provisional government and was raising an army. Within months, they had formally deposed Ferdinand as their king and offered the Bohemian crown to a young Calvinist prince from Western Germany named Frederick V, Elector of the Palatinate. He accepted. His wife, the daughter of the King of England, reportedly wept when he said yes. She knew what was coming. History would call them the Winter King and the Winter Queen, because their reign lasted almost exactly one season before the roof caved in. Ferdinand, now Holy Roman Emperor, did not hesitate. He called in every favor, summoned every ally, and unleashed a Catholic army on Bohemia that was terrifying in its efficiency. At the Battle of White Mountain in 1620, just outside Prague, the Protestant Bohemian army, poorly organized, poorly led, demoralized, was crushed in less than 2 hours. Frederick fled into exile. The Bohemian Protestant nobility was decimated. 27 of their leaders were publicly executed in the main square of Prague, their heads displayed on the Charles Bridge as a warning. The letter of majesty guaranteeing Protestant rights was torn up in public by Ferdinand's own hand. It should have been over. Ferdinand had won. The rebellion had been crushed. The Habsburgs were stronger than ever. But it wasn't over. Not even close. Because what Ferdinand didn't understand, what nobody at the time fully grasped, was that by crushing Bohemia so completely and so publicly, he had terrified every Protestant prince in Europe into realizing that compromise was no longer possible. The message of White Mountain wasn't just, "We won." The message was, "This is what we'll do to all of you." And that message was received. The Protestant princes of Germany began quietly, desperately, building alliances. And in the courts of Denmark and Sweden and France, rulers who had been watching from a safe distance started doing calculations. Not theological calculations, political ones. Because Ferdinand's victory wasn't just a Catholic victory.
It was a Habsburg victory. And a Habsburg that powerful, a Habsburg who controlled both the empire and Spain, a Habsburg who was now rolling back Protestant autonomy across Central Europe. That was a Habsburg who might soon be powerful enough to dominate the whole continent. And that fear of domination, that ancient terror of one power swallowing all the others, was when the war stopped being a religious civil war and started becoming something much, much bigger. Something that would pull in kings and mercenaries and armies from every corner of Europe. Something that would burn for 28 more years after White Mountain and leave a landscape that looked like the end of the world. The men who marched into that war in the name of God, the soldiers who believed, genuinely believed, they were fighting for their faith, for their eternal souls, for the right to worship as their conscience demanded. Many of them were sincere. Don't mistake that. The faith was real. The terror of damnation was real. The conviction that God Himself was watching, keeping score, waiting to see who stood firm and who surrendered. That was as real to them as the weight of the pike in their hands or the cold of the November mud under their boots.
But the armies that carried that faith into battle were something else entirely, something the Church had never fully anticipated and could never fully control. The armies of the 30 Years' War were not national armies. There was no Germany yet, not as a unified country with a flag and a draft and a chain of command running from a single capital. What there was instead was a market, a vast, brutal, entrepreneurial market for military violence. Generals, men like Albrecht von Wallenstein, one of the most extraordinary figures of the entire era, were not exactly soldiers in the modern sense. They were military contractors. They raised armies the way a modern CEO raises capital. They borrowed money, hired colonels who hired captains, who recruited soldiers with promises of pay and plunder. The general delivered the army to the ruler who needed it. The ruler was supposed to pay. And when the ruler couldn't pay, which was almost always, the army paid itself. How did an army pay itself when there was no paymaster? It ate the land. That's the phrase contemporaries used, and they meant it literally. An army on the march needed food, fodder for horses, wood for fires, tools, shoes, clothing, replacement weapons. None of that appeared from nowhere. It was taken. Villages were stripped clean, granaries emptied, livestock slaughtered or driven away, wine cellars drunk dry. Anything that couldn't be eaten or carried was often burned, either out of spite or to deny it to the enemy. The soldiers called it contributions, a darkly ironic euphemism for organized terror. And the soldiers themselves, picture who actually filled the ranks of these armies. At the very top, you had aristocratic officers, younger sons of noble families, men who had been trained from childhood for war, who wore expensive armor and kept personal servants. But below them, stretching all the way down through the ranks to the ragged, barely armed infantry, you had the desperate, the displaced, the criminal, the starving. Men who had lost their farms to debt or war, ex-convicts, refugees from already devastated regions, veterans who had known nothing but fighting since adolescence and had no idea how to do anything else. And alongside the soldiers, a trailing cloud of camp followers, wives, children, sutlers selling food and drink and other necessities, servants, priests, surgeons, con men, fortune tellers. A large army on the march was essentially a city in motion. A city of 30 or 40,000 people, consuming everything in its path like a slow, catastrophic brush fire. The religious justification for this machine was maintained with varying degrees of conviction, depending on who was doing the maintaining.
Imperial Catholic armies marched with priests and crucifixes at their head. Swedish Lutheran forces sang hymns before battle and listened to sermons in the field. But the actual behavior of these armies, the looting, the burning, the casual, industrialized brutality against civilian populations, had very little to do with theology. What it had to do with was the simple, merciless logic of survival in an economy of scarcity. You took because you had to. You burned because it was efficient. You killed because witnesses were dangerous. This is the thing that modern accounts of the war often sanitize. The 30 Years' War was not primarily a war of battles. Pitched battles, the kind where two armies line up and crash into each other on an open field. Those happened, and they were spectacular and terrible. But the vast majority of the suffering in this war came from the day-to-day operations of armies moving through the countryside.
From requisitioning that became robbery, that became rape and murder when the inhabitants resisted, or simply when the soldiers were hungry and angry and there was no one to stop them. There were whole systems developed for this. A practice called quartering, where soldiers would be billeted in civilian homes, which sounds almost civilized, until you understand that the soldiers ate the family's food, slept in the family's beds, and the family had absolutely no legal recourse if the soldiers decided to take anything else they wanted. There was military execution, where a unit would descend on a village that hadn't paid its required contribution and systematically destroy it until payment was made. The contemporary German word for this was Brandschatzung, essentially fire ransom. Pay up or we burn it down. And sometimes they burned it down anyway. Accounts from survivors, and there are hundreds of them preserved in church records, diaries, municipal chronicles, describe scenes of almost hallucinatory horror. A pastor in a Württemberg village writes about soldiers arriving at dawn, demanding food and money, and when told there was nothing left, spending 3 days systematically torturing the male inhabitants until someone revealed where valuables were hidden. A Bavarian farmer describes watching his neighbor's house burn and understanding, with sudden cold clarity, that his own house would be next. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing, he could do about it. A woman in a Pomeranian town records hiding in a root cellar with her children for 4 days while armies passed overhead, listening to the screaming, not daring to breathe too loud. These weren't exceptional incidents. They were the texture of the war. They were what the war felt like from the ground, from the level of the people who couldn't fight back and couldn't flee because they had nowhere to go and no means to get there. And the church, both churches, Catholic and Protestant, watched this unfold with a kind of helpless, horrified impotence. Bishops issued proclamations against atrocities. Commanders occasionally hanged a soldier pour encourager les autres. Protestant pastors prayed for divine deliverance and tried to explain to their congregations why God was allowing this. Catholic priests administered last rites to dying soldiers, while the villages around them smoldered. The theological machinery that had launched the war had very quickly lost control of the machine it had set in motion. By the early 1620s, the war had already become something that none of its original architects would have recognized or sanctioned. And it was about to get immeasurably worse. Because now, the great powers were coming. Denmark entered the war in 1625. The Danish king, Christian IV, saw himself as the natural champion of German Protestantism, and also saw a golden strategic opportunity to extend Danish influence over the rich trading ports of northern Germany. He marched in with a well-equipped army, absolute confidence, and a catastrophically poor understanding of what he was walking into. The imperial commander, Albrecht von Wallenstein, met him with an army so large and so efficiently funded that contemporaries couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. Where had this army come from? How was Wallenstein paying for it?
The answer was the system taken to its ultimate extreme. Wallenstein had essentially privatized the entire war economy of northern Germany, extracting contributions from every town and territory in his path with a cold mathematical precision that was almost admirable if you could ignore what it was doing to the people being extracted from. Christian of Denmark was beaten so thoroughly that he sued for peace within 3 years. He got out with his kingdom intact only because Wallenstein advised Emperor Ferdinand to be lenient, not out of mercy, but out of cold, strategic calculation. A Denmark humiliated but not destroyed was less dangerous than a Denmark with nothing left to lose. That kind of thinking, that chess master cold-bloodedness wrapped in military genius, was what made Wallenstein perhaps the most fascinating and most frightening figure of the whole war. He was a Bohemian nobleman who had converted to Catholicism not out of burning conviction, but out of calculation. He was enormously wealthy, having bought up vast tracts of land confiscated from Protestant Bohemian nobles after White Mountain at prices that were essentially theft. He was strange, obsessed with astrology, barely sleeping, prone to long silences and sudden, explosive decisions. His soldiers simultaneously feared him and were loyal to him in the way that soldiers become loyal to a commander who always makes sure they're paid and fed. He was probably the greatest military organizer in the history of the war, and he made Ferdinand nervous in ways that Ferdinand couldn't quite articulate, because Wallenstein's loyalty was to Wallenstein's vision of power, and that vision didn't necessarily align with Ferdinand's. The Catholic cause reached its high water mark in 1629 when Ferdinand issued the Edict of Restitution, a sweeping decree demanding the return of all church lands secularized since 1552. In theory, it was a religious restoration. In practice, it meant stripping Protestant princes and cities of enormous territories and wealth they'd held for 3 generations. It was as if the federal government suddenly declared that every building built on land acquired from a dissolved monastery had to be given back to the church, regardless of who'd lived there, who'd built there, who'd paid taxes there for 80 years. The Protestant world reacted with fury and terror. Even Catholic princes were alarmed, because an emperor powerful enough to impose this was an emperor powerful enough to swallow their autonomy next. And then something happened that nobody had predicted, something that would change the entire shape of the war. From across the Baltic Sea, a fleet appeared. On its ships stood the most disciplined, most innovative military force in Europe, the Army of Sweden. And at its head, standing at the prow as the coast of Germany came into view, was a man who believed with absolute, unshakable certainty that God had personally chosen him to save Protestant Europe. His name was Gustavus Adolphus. He was 35 years old. He had been king since the age of 16. He had fought wars in Russia, Poland, and Denmark, and won all of them. He had spent years reforming the Swedish army into something that looked almost nothing like the armies of his era. Faster, more flexible, with a revolutionary integration of cavalry, infantry, and artillery that his enemies couldn't match and couldn't quite figure out. His soldiers were disciplined in a way that seemed almost inhuman by the standards of the time. They were paid regularly. They were prohibited from looting on pain of death. They sang psalms before battle. They were, in short, everything a religious army was supposed to be, and nothing like what every other religious army in this war had actually become. When Gustavus landed in Germany in 1630, Protestant princes who had been cautious, hedging, desperately trying to stay neutral, they had a choice to make. Join the Lion of the North, as his admirers were already calling him, or stand aside and hope the emperor's armies treated them gently. Most of them made the wrong initial calculation. Most of them hedged. Most of them waited. And while they waited, one of the worst atrocities of the entire war unfolded in a city that had thought its walls would protect it. Magdeburg.
A prosperous Protestant city on the Elbe River, one of the largest in northern Germany. A city that had held out against imperial siege for months, waiting for Gustavus to come to its rescue, trusting that the Protestant champion would arrive in time. He didn't. On the 20th of May, 1631, Imperial and League forces under the command of Count Tilly broke through Magdeburg's defenses. What followed was one of the defining atrocities of the entire 30 Years' War. An event so catastrophic that German speakers coined a new word for total destruction that derived from the city's name. The sack of Magdeburg lasted 2 days. The killing was systematic at first, then became simply frenzied, as soldiers who had been camped outside the walls for months poured into a city full of terrified civilians and more wealth than most of them had seen in their lives. Scholars still debate the precise death toll. Estimates in contemporary sources range dramatically, and modern historians place the figure somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 people, with the uncertainty itself a testament to how completely the city's records and record keepers were destroyed. What is beyond debate is the scale of the annihilation. The city burned almost completely to the ground, whether deliberately set by the defenders, accidentally ignited by the attackers, or some combination. No one has ever determined with certainty. When it was over, Magdeburg, a city that had been home to tens of thousands of souls, a cathedral city, a center of trade and culture, was essentially gone. A contemporary wrote that there was nothing left to see but open sky and the dead on the ground and the cathedral walls still standing, as if God had arranged the ruins as a monument to what humans could do to each other. The news of Magdeburg spread through Europe like a shockwave. Protestant princes who had been paralyzed by indecision suddenly found their decisions made for them. Gustavus Adolphus found allies flooding to his banner, not because they had become more confident, but because Magdeburg had shown them what the alternative looked like. The war was entering its next phase, and in this phase, the Lion of the North would drive everything before him, until the moment when even a lion could be stopped by a single musket ball in the fog of a November battlefield. And the war, deprived of its most extraordinary protagonist, would be forced to find a new reason to continue destroying everything it touched. And it would find that reason, because by now the war had developed its own terrible momentum, fed by unpaid armies that could only survive by fighting, by rulers who had invested too much blood and treasure to accept anything less than total victory, by a generation of soldiers who had known nothing else and had no world to return to. The war had become a living thing. It fed on the land, on the people, on the faith that had supposedly started it. And somewhere in the smoking ruins of 100 burned villages, in the mass graves outside a dozen sacked cities, the question of Catholic versus Protestant had dissolved into something much simpler and much more savage. Something closer to pure, self-perpetuating violence. Something that even the people inside it were starting to understand might never end. That understanding, that creeping, nauseating realization among soldiers and commanders and rulers alike that they were trapped inside a machine none of them could stop, that's where the war was about to go next. Into its darkest, strangest, most morally grotesque chapter, where armies turned on their own populations, where a Catholic cardinal bankrolled Protestant armies to destroy Catholic imperial forces, where soldiers who hadn't been paid in years began making their own deals, their own truces, their own private wars within the war. Where the geography of Central Europe began to look less like a political map and more like a wound that kept reopening. The parade was just beginning, and it was carrying butchers. The parade had no beginning you could point to. That's the thing about it. There was no moment when someone blew a horn and announced that civilization in Central Europe was ending. It just accumulated.
One burned village became 10, became 100. One mass grave became a landscape of mass graves. One generation of children who had never known peace became the soldiers who made sure the next generation wouldn't know it either. The machine didn't announce itself. It just kept moving, kept eating, kept leaving behind it that particular silence that falls over a place where people used to be. By the early 1630s, you could walk through entire districts of what is now southern Germany and not find a living soul for miles. Not because everyone had died, though many had, but because the survivors had learned the one lesson the war taught reliably. When you hear hoofbeats in the distance, you don't wait to see whose flag they're flying. You take what you can carry, and you run. Protestant, Catholic, Imperial, Swedish, it didn't matter anymore. An army was an army. And an army meant hunger, and hunger meant violence. And violence meant that whatever you had built, whatever you had grown, whatever you had managed to hold on to through the last raid and the last winter, it was gone. The peasants of the Holy Roman Empire developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to early warning signs. A cloud of dust on the road 3 miles out. The sound of hooves, distant but growing. Dogs going quiet in a particular way. Travelers appearing from the east or west with that specific expression on their faces. Not quite panic, something more practiced than panic. The face of someone who has already run from this exact thing before. When those signs appeared, entire communities would vanish into the forests within the hour. They built hidden shelters in the woods, dugouts, lean-tos, camouflaged pits covered with branches where families would huddle for days, feeding infants quietly, shushing children, listening to the sounds of their village being systematically stripped or burned, waiting for the silence that meant the soldiers had moved on. And when they came back, if they came back to find their world in negative. The outlines of everything they'd owned still visible. The scorched foundation where the house had been, the churned mud of the garden, the empty posts where animals had been tethered. Everything reduced to its ghost. This was not the exception. This was the rhythm. Year after year after year. Armies moved through like weather, except worse than weather because weather didn't torture you to find out where you'd buried your coins. The soldiers themselves, and here is where you have to hold 2 things in your head at once, were also suffering. This is not an excuse, it is a fact. The men who were committing these atrocities were frequently half-starved, unpaid for months, dressed in rags, sleeping in the open in German winters that could kill you from the cold alone, dying of diseases that spread through military camps the way fire spreads through dry grass. Typhus, dysentery, plague. An army of 30,000 men could lose half its effective strength to disease in a single campaign season without fighting a single pitched battle. The soldiers who survived that, who kept marching, kept fighting, were survivors of a particular brutal selection process. Softness had been burned out of them. Whatever capacity they had once possessed for restraint had been eroded by hunger and cold and the daily spectacle of death, until what remained was something harder and more dangerous and less recognizably human. The commanders knew this. The better ones, men like Gustavus Adolphus, who had genuine standards and actually enforced them, understood that an army that terrorized the civilian population was an army that was destroying the very base it needed to survive. You can't feed an army from a scorched earth. You can't extract contributions from a population that has fled into the forest. Every village you burn is a village that can never feed you next winter. This was not a moral argument, it was a logistical one. But it was an argument that required enormous discipline and constant vigilance to maintain, and most commanders of the era did not have that discipline or did not care to exercise it even if they did. So the butchery became the norm. not a departure from normal operations, the norm itself, the baseline, the thing you planned around and managed and occasionally tried to limit, but never actually stopped. And into this landscape, in the summer of 1631, strode Gustavus Adolphus with his disciplined, psalm-singing, regularly paid Swedish army. And for a moment, a brief, extraordinary moment, it looked like the Lion of the North might actually be able to stop the machine. He won battles, remarkable battles. At Breitenfeld in September of 1631, the Swedish forces and their Saxon allies shattered an imperial army under the aged Commander Tilly in a battle so decisive it was felt across the entire continent. Protestant churches rang their bells. Protestant preachers sermonized about divine providence. Protestant princes exhaled for the first time in years. The momentum of the war, which had been running so hard toward total Habsburg domination, had been violently reversed. Gustavus marched into the Catholic heartland of southern Germany, wintering his army in Munich, receiving delegations from princes who had spent years very carefully not committing to anyone. The war, impossibly, seemed winnable. For the Protestants, for the Swedes.
For the vision that Gustavus carried, a northern Protestant bloc centered on Sweden that would permanently curtail Habsburg power and guarantee the survival of Reformed Christianity in Europe. Then came November 1632. The village of Lutzen in Saxony. Fog so thick you couldn't see 20 feet in front of you. Two massive armies groping toward each other through the gray. The Battle of Lutzen was brutal and confused, and ultimately a Swedish tactical victory. But somewhere in the fog, in the chaos of charging cavalry and crashing musket volleys and screaming horses, Gustavus Adolphus was shot. Not once, several times. He fell from his horse. His body was found hours later, stripped by soldiers who didn't know or didn't care who he was, face down in the mud, already dead. He was 37 years old. The silence that followed that announcement, when it spread from camp to camp, from city to city, from Protestant court to Protestant court across Europe, was the silence of a world realizing something terrible. The one man who had seemed capable of ending this war on terms that made any kind of moral sense was gone. His daughter, a 6-year-old girl named Christina, was now the Queen of Sweden. The army was now commanded by capable but smaller men. The cause was now guided by committee. And the war simply continued. Because wars don't stop because their justifications die. They stop when someone runs out of soldiers or money. And nobody had quite run out yet. Into the vacuum left by Gustavus, Wallenstein moved. And watching Wallenstein move in the months after Lutzen is like watching a chess grandmaster play a game that nobody else quite understands. He fought, but not decisively. He negotiated, secretly, with enemies he was supposed to be fighting. He moved his massive army through Bohemia and Silesia in patterns that defied easy strategic explanation. He was ill, some kind of chronic condition that left him in constant pain, often unable to ride. He issued orders from his carriage. He corresponded with Swedish commanders. He sent messages to Protestant princes. He sent messages to the French. What was he doing? Even his own officers didn't know. Was he planning to defect? Was he planning to impose his own peace settlement on the exhausted continent, making himself the indispensable broker between all sides? Was he simply protecting his own enormous wealth and power in a war whose outcome had become impossible to predict? To this day, historians argue about it. What is certain is that Emperor Ferdinand heard enough whispers, enough fragments of intercepted correspondence, enough reports from nervous Catholic commanders to reach a conclusion. Wallenstein had become too powerful, too unpredictable, too potentially disloyal to be left alive.
In February of 1634, in a town in Bohemia called Eger, Wallenstein was assassinated. Irish and Scottish mercenary officers, soldiers who had been recruited into imperial service from the fringes of Europe, men with no personal loyalty to any German cause, burst into his bedchamber in the middle of the night and ran him through with a pike. He was in his nightgown. He didn't even have time to call for help. The greatest military mind of the 30 Years' War died in his bedroom in a rented house, surrounded by strangers, killed by men his own emperor had paid. And whatever secret strategy he'd been building, whatever grand design he'd been drawing, it died with him, unspoken, taken to a grave that nobody celebrated and nobody mourned very loudly. What followed Wallenstein's death was a period of such nauseating complexity, such dizzying realignment of loyalties, that even people who lived through it sometimes couldn't explain afterward whose side they'd been on and why.
This is the part of the 30 Years' War that doesn't make it into simplified historical accounts. Because simplified historical accounts need clear sides. Good guys, bad guys, Protestants, Catholics, Empire, rebels. But by the mid-1630s, those categories had become almost meaningless on the ground. Consider what had already happened to the concept of alliance. The Protestant Union, the defensive alliance of Protestant princes that had supposedly started this whole thing, had dissolved in the early stages of the war, its members unwilling to sacrifice their own security for each other's benefit. The Catholic League had held together better, but it was shot through with competing interests, with princes who wanted Habsburg protection, but not Habsburg dominance. Sweden had entered as a Protestant champion and was now essentially fighting to protect its territorial gains in northern Germany, which was a very different thing from protecting German Protestant liberties. France, Catholic France, governed by a cardinal of the church, was bankrolling Swedish Protestant armies because French statecraft demanded the weakening of Habsburg power. And if that meant paying Lutherans and Calvinists to kill Catholics, then Cardinal Richelieu was perfectly prepared to make that calculation and sleep soundly afterward. Let that sit for a moment. The chief minister of the most Christian king of France, a man in a cardinal's red robes, a servant of the Pope's own church, was the single most important financier of the Protestant military effort in the Holy Roman Empire. Because the alternative, a Habsburg that dominated all of Central Europe, was more dangerous to French interests than any amount of theological inconsistency. This was realpolitik before the word existed. This was the moment when the religious justification for the war collided with geopolitical reality, and geopolitical reality won without even breaking a sweat. And the Protestant princes of Germany? Many of them, exhausted and terrified, and desperate for any path out of the endless devastation, signed the Peace of Prague in 1635, a negotiated settlement with the emperor on terms that were far from ideal, but were at least terms. They would get to keep most of the church lands they held. The Edict of Restitution would be suspended. In return, they would support the emperor militarily and expel the Swedes from German soil. They accepted. And just like that, Protestant German princes found themselves marching, technically, in the same direction as their Catholic emperor, against a Swedish army that had been their salvation 5 years earlier. Soldiers who had fought alongside Swedish regiments for campaigns, who had shared campfires and shared victories, and shared the particular bond that forms between men who have survived battles together. Those same soldiers now received orders to turn their weapons around, to face the direction they had been marching from. The Swedes, who had come as liberators, were now, by the logic of the Peace of Prague, an occupying foreign force that needed to be expelled. Try to imagine the conversation in a German regiment the week that news arrived. The colonel reading out the new orders, the sergeants looking at each other, the men in the ranks,
many of whom had been fighting since they were 16, who couldn't remember a world without this war, trying to process the information that the enemy had changed again. That the alliance they'd built their survival around had just been legally dissolved by treaty. That the men camped 2 miles to the north, with whom they'd shared a cause and shared rations, were now, on paper, the other side. Some of them refused. Some deserted. Many, with the blank pragmatism of professional survivors, simply updated their understanding of which direction the killing was going, and kept going in that direction.
Because what else were they going to do? Go home? There was no home. There were just varying degrees of ruins.
The Peace of Prague solved nothing. The Swedes didn't leave. They had no intention of leaving, because leaving meant abandoning the territorial gains that had cost them enormously in blood and money. And Sweden's Queen Regent and her ministers had no intention of absorbing those costs for nothing. France accelerated its direct military involvement, dropping the fiction of merely subsidizing other people's wars and committing French armies directly to the conflict. Spain, fighting its own war with France along the Pyrenean frontier and struggling to maintain its supply lines to the Netherlands, found its capacity stretched to breaking. The Empire, which had seemed so close to total victory after White Mountain, found itself fighting on multiple fronts against multiple enemies, with resources that kept dwindling and armies that kept demanding to be fed. And the land, the actual physical land of Central Europe, continued to die. There are population records, painstaking compilations from church rolls and tax registers and municipal censuses that tell a story so stark it stops feeling like history and starts feeling like something else entirely. Württemberg in southwestern Germany lost close to 3/4 of its population over the course of the war. Though the losses came from multiple causes tangled together, disease and famine killed far more than swords and muskets, and many survivors fled rather than died, scattering across the continent in ways that made them impossible to count. But whether death or displacement, the human world of those places was unmade. The Duchy of Mecklenburg in the north lost roughly half its people. Parts of Brandenburg looked, as one Swedish officer wrote in a letter home, like the surface of the moon, cratered, silent, empty, stretching to the horizon with nothing moving on it.
Villages that had existed for centuries simply ceased to exist. Not just burned, ceased. The people were gone, scattered to the four winds or dead. And when no one returned to plant the fields, the forest moved back in. You can still see the ghostly outlines of some of those lost settlements in aerial photographs of German forests today. The geometry of old field boundaries, the circular depression where a well used to be, the faint linear patterns where a road once ran. The forest swallowed them, but the earth remembered. And in the middle of all this dying, the war found a way to become even more perverse. Because by the late 1630s, something had shifted in the basic operating logic of every army in the conflict. Pay had become almost entirely theoretical. The promises made to soldiers at the beginning of campaigns, promises of wages, of shares in plunder, of land grants after victory, had been deferred so many times, broken so casually, that even the most loyal veteran understood they were fiction. What soldiers actually received was the right to take what they needed from whatever population happened to be nearby. But here's the consequence nobody planned for. This system, this improvised subsistence model where armies fed themselves from the land, created a terrible incentive structure.
Armies that won quickly and ended the war put themselves out of a job and lost access to the economy of extraction that kept them alive. Armies that kept the war going, that moved from region to region, that maintained a state of managed conflict, those armies kept eating. They kept surviving. Peace, for a professional soldier of the 30 Years' War, was not a relief. It was a catastrophe. Peace meant unemployment. Peace meant no more right to quarter yourself in someone else's house. Peace meant competing in a civilian economy for which you had no skills and which had been so devastated that there was barely anything left to compete over.
So the war perpetuated itself. Not because anyone was winning, not because anyone had a realistic path to the total victory they'd originally imagined, but because the machinery of the war had become the mechanism of survival for hundreds of thousands of people. Soldiers, officers, arms manufacturers, military financiers, sutlers, camp followers. And dismantling that machinery meant dismantling the only functioning economic system in a landscape where all other systems had been destroyed. This is the moment, somewhere in the late 1630s, where the 30 Years' War stopped being a war in any traditional sense and became something more like a permanent condition, a managed disaster, a system of organized suffering that everyone inside it hated and no one inside it could figure out how to leave. Generals negotiated with each other secretly, looking for off-ramps, then kept fighting because the political authorities behind them couldn't agree on terms. Peace conferences were called and adjourned and called again. Preliminary negotiations dragged on for years because the question of who was even entitled to be at the table, which princes, which powers, which dispossessed nobles, which destroyed cities, required its own sub-conference to resolve. Meanwhile, the armies kept moving, kept eating, kept leaving that particular stillness behind them, the stillness of places drained of everything human. The Swedish army, in these years, conducted raids deeper and deeper into the empire. Not because Sweden had territorial ambitions over Bavaria or Bohemia, but because Swedish field commanders needed to feed their men and pay for the war somehow. And the only available method was to keep finding new regions that hadn't been stripped yet. There was a military logic to this that was also a kind of madness. The further you marched from your strategic objectives, the more you risked. But the less you marched, the more your army disintegrated from hunger.
So you marched. Always marched. Always forward, always into somewhere new. Always with that trailing cloud of destruction that marked where an army had been as clearly as a comet's tail. The French armies that poured across the Rhine in these years were, by the standards of the era, somewhat better disciplined. Richelieu and his successors understood that making France hated in Germany was bad strategy. But somewhat better disciplined still meant extracting contributions, still meant quartering soldiers in unwilling homes, still meant that every town a French army passed through paid a price that nobody had agreed to and nobody could refuse. The Spanish, fighting to maintain their corridor of supply from Italy through the Alps into the Spanish Netherlands, the so-called Spanish Road, found that corridor increasingly contested, increasingly expensive, increasingly impossible to maintain. Spanish silver from the New World, which had been the financial engine of Habsburg military power for a century, was flowing in, but never fast enough. Spain was funding wars in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Italy, in France, on the Atlantic, and the arithmetic simply didn't work. You cannot fight everywhere forever, even if you own the world's richest silver mines. And the emperor, Ferdinand III now, Ferdinand II having died in 1637, worn out, the man who had started it all with his absolute conviction that he could re-Catholicize the empire,
sat in Vienna and received reports from all these fronts, and understood, with a clarity that his father had never quite achieved, that there was no version of this war that ended in total victory for anyone. The Edict of Restitution was gone. No one was going to enforce it. No army was going to make it stick. It was a dead letter in a filing cabinet in a burned capital. The dream of a uniformly Catholic empire was gone. What remained was the question of how much everyone was willing to lose before they agreed to stop. And everyone, every ruler, every general, every exhausted diplomat, was still calculating. Still counting their losses and their leverage and their minimum acceptable outcome. Still convincing themselves that another campaign season might improve their position enough to get better terms at the table. 100,000 soldiers still in the field. Millions of civilians still subject to their passage. A landscape already so devastated that recovery would take a century. And the negotiations for peace already underway in 2 Westphalian cities, moving at a pace that could only be described as geological. Slow, grinding, contested at every point, interrupted by fresh fighting, complicated by fresh betrayals. The diplomats gathered in Osnabrück and Münster were trying to rebuild an entire continent's political order from first principles, while the armies, whose existence made the negotiation necessary, kept burning things down around them. It couldn't go on. Everyone knew it couldn't go on. The only question, the agonizing, years-long, blood-soaked question, was how to make it stop. It was a French army that finally broke something loose. Not through a great victory, through exhaustion so complete it looked, from a distance, almost like wisdom. The year is 1642. Cardinal Richelieu is dying in Paris, his body failing faster than his mind, still dictating policy from his sickbed, still moving pieces on a board that only he could see the whole of. He has spent the better part of 2 decades engineering French involvement in this war, subsidizing, maneuvering, finally committing French armies directly, and the results are simultaneously impressive and catastrophic. France is stronger relative to the Habsburgs than it has been in a century. France is also hemorrhaging money, losing men, watching its own peasantry revolt against the tax burden of a war that seems to have no bottom. Richelieu dies in December. 5 months later, Louis XIII dies too. The most powerful kingdom in Europe is suddenly being governed on behalf of a 4-year-old boy by his mother and a new cardinal, Mazarin. An Italian by birth, a pragmatist by temperament, a man who had watched the whole arc of this war long enough to understand something that Richelieu had always known, but never quite said out loud. You could win every battle and still lose. Because winning battles didn't end this war. Nothing ended this war except a negotiated settlement, and a negotiated settlement required everyone to simultaneously admit that their maximum demands were never going to be met. And in the 17th century, getting sovereign rulers and proud dynasties and ancient religious institutions to simultaneously admit failure, simultaneously, all of them at the same table, was the diplomatic equivalent of threading a needle in a hurricane. But by 1643, something had shifted. You could feel it in the dispatches, in the letters between rulers, in the tone of the reports coming from field commanders. The shift wasn't hope. Hope had died somewhere around year 15. It was something grimmer and more useful than hope. It was the recognition, spreading slowly from court to court across the shattered continent, that the alternative to negotiation was not victory. The alternative to negotiation was this. More of this. Another decade of moving armies through a landscape that was already running out of things to give them. Another 10 years of the stillness that follows an army's passage. Another generation of children growing up in root cellars and burned-out church naves, learning to read fear the way other children learn to read books. That recognition didn't produce peace immediately.
Nothing about this war produced anything immediately, but it produced something almost as valuable. It produced diplomats who were authorized to make real concessions. And in the two Westphalian cities of Osnabrück and Münster, in the autumn of 1643, those diplomats began to gather. The Congress of Westphalia, and calling it a congress makes it sound more organized than it was, became the largest diplomatic gathering Europe had ever seen. Representatives from nearly every power in the conflict, and many that had only tangential involvement, crowded into those two medium-sized German cities and began the most complicated negotiation in the history of international relations up to that point. There were questions of territory and sovereignty and religious rights and dynastic succession and the status of every bishopric and city and principality that had changed hands in 30 years of war. There were questions about who got to be in the room at all. Dispossessed nobles, devastated free cities, representatives of populations that no longer existed in the numbers they had at the start. There were questions of diplomatic protocol so intricate, so laden with the accumulated precedent of centuries, that arguments about the order in which delegates entered a room and the exact phrasing of their titles consumed weeks of negotiation before anyone got to the actual substance. Meanwhile, outside those rooms, in the fields and forests and shattered towns of Central Europe, the war continued. This is the thing that makes this period almost unbearable to contemplate. The negotiations ran for 5 years. 5 years of talking, of drafting and redrafting, of walking out and coming back, of furious correspondence between delegations and their home governments, of arguments about clauses and sub-clauses and the precise Latin phrasing of legal guarantees. 5 years. And for every single day of those 5 years, armies were in the field. Soldiers were dying. Villages were being stripped. People who had survived 25 years of this war were surviving year 26 and 27 and 28, not knowing, they had no way of knowing, that the men in Osnabrück and Münster were getting closer, that the end was being assembled, word by word, in overheated rooms, while their world kept burning. The last desperate military moves of the war have a particular flavor of pointlessness that is almost hallucinatory. Commanders on all sides understood, by the mid-1640s, that the war was going to end at the negotiating table. They also understood that the position you held at the negotiating table depended heavily on the position your armies held in the field at the moment negotiations concluded. So the fighting continued, not because anyone believed in total military victory anymore, but because every general knew that a battle won this autumn might translate into a clause gained or a clause prevented in the treaty. Soldiers died for sub-clauses. Men were killed in action to improve a diplomat's leverage over the wording of a legal guarantee that would be forgotten within a generation. It is hard to think of a more purely absurd way to organize human death, and yet within the logic of the situation, it was completely rational. That's the thing about systems of violence. They develop their own internal rationality that is entirely disconnected from any human value you might care about. The French, under Condé and Turenne, young commanders who had come of age entirely inside this war, who had never known a Europe that wasn't fighting, won a series of increasingly decisive victories against Spanish and imperial forces in the mid-1640s. Condé was 22 when he shattered a Spanish army at Rocroi in 1643, a battle so decisive it effectively announced the end of Spanish military supremacy in Europe and the beginning of French dominance. He fought with a reckless, almost joyful aggression that was shocking even by the standards of the era. He was magnificent and terrifying and possibly slightly mad in the way that only men who have been made for war and given unlimited war to make can be.
he was also fighting for subclauses. They were all fighting for subclauses by the end. The Swedes, in these final years, conducted their most audacious operations of the entire war. A Swedish army drove deep into Bohemia, reaching the outskirts of Prague itself, the city where it had all started 30 years earlier, with men thrown from a window. Swedish soldiers stood on the Charles Bridge and looked at the city and knew that the war was ending, and launched one final assault to improve Sweden's position at the table, seizing the western half of the city and stripping its art collections and libraries with the efficient thoroughness of men who understood they were performing a last act before the curtain came down. The famous astronomical instruments of Tycho Brahe, the tools that had helped map the heavens, were carted off to Sweden as war trophies. Even the stars couldn't escape the accounting of this war. There was fighting in Bavaria. There was fighting along the Rhine. There was a Swedish army under Wrangel that marched through territories so devastated that his soldiers, men hardened by 20 years of campaigning, wrote home describing the landscape as something from the end of time. Not metaphorically, they literally used apocalyptic language, biblical language, reaching for the imagery of revelation, because nothing in their ordinary vocabulary could describe what they were seeing. Fields grown back to forest, towns reduced to chimneys, roads disappearing into weeds. And moving through this landscape, these armies of ghosts in a ghost country, fighting battles whose outcomes would be translated into legal language by men sitting in comfortable rooms in Westphalia.
The last battle of the 30 Years' War was fought in the final days before the peace was signed. Men died, real men, with names and histories and people somewhere who would wait for them to come home, in the last week of a war that was already over in every meaningful sense. The orders traveled slowly, couriers on horseback across a broken landscape. And somewhere in that gap between the signing of the peace and the arrival of the news, the final guns were fired and the final blood was spilled. And nobody who died in those last hours died for anything at all. Not for faith, not for dynasty, not even for subclauses. Just for the time it took a rider to cover 30 miles of bad road. The Peace of Westphalia was signed on the 24th of October, 1648. Actually, two separate treaties were signed, one in Osnabrück, one in Münster, on the same day, each addressing different combinations of the warring powers, both together constituting what history calls the Peace of Westphalia. When the news reached the armies still in the field, when it reached the battered cities, when it reached the forests where families had been hiding, the reaction was not, by most accounts, joy. Not the wild street celebrations you might expect after the end of the longest war in memory. What the sources describe, again and again, is something quieter and stranger than joy. A stunned, uncertain stillness. As if people couldn't quite trust it. As if decades of learning to expect the worst had made it physically impossible to believe in good news, even when the good news was real and documented and sealed with the wax stamps of every major power in Europe. A pastor in a small Thuringian town wrote in his church register on the day the news arrived, "God be praised, the war is over. But what is left for peace to find?" He didn't know how to finish the entry. The ink trails off. He left the rest of the page blank, and nobody ever filled it in. That blank page is the real document of the Peace of Westphalia. Not the legal text, not the carefully negotiated clauses, not the diplomatic masterwork that historians celebrate as the foundation of the modern international order. That blank page
in that small, burned-out town, written by a man who had watched his entire world unmade and couldn't find words adequate to what remained. What the peace actually settled, the substance of those 5 years of negotiation, was an extraordinary thing to look at. The religious question, the question that had supposedly started everything, was resolved with a pragmatic ruthlessness that would have horrified every true believer on every side who had died for their faith. Calvinism was officially recognized alongside Lutheranism and Catholicism. Church lands would be allocated based on who held them in 1624, a reference year calculated to give each side something to hold on to without requiring anyone to fully win. The Edict of Restitution, Ferdinand's great project of religious restoration, was dead and buried. The territorial settlements gave Sweden enormous gains in northern Germany, the Baltic coast, key river mouths, positions that made Sweden the dominant power in that entire region. France gained territories in Alsace and Lorraine that began the long process of pushing French power toward the Rhine. The Swiss Confederation and the Dutch Republic were formally recognized as independent states, the Dutch independence from Spain finally acknowledged after 80 years of their own war. And the hundreds of princes of the Holy Roman Empire received something that would prove more consequential than any territorial settlement. They received, formally and legally codified, the right to conduct their own foreign policy, to make their own alliances, to be, in a meaningful sense, sovereign within their own territories. The emperor remained, and the empire remained, but the emperor's power over the princes had been so thoroughly curtailed that what remained was a title more than a reality. Germany would not be a unified nation-state for another 200 years, and the Peace of Westphalia was a large part of the reason why. But none of that, none of the legal architecture, the territorial adjustments, the religious compromises, the constitutional settlements, captures what the peace actually cost. What was paid for it? What had to be surrendered that could never be given back? Württemberg had entered the war with a population of somewhere around 400,000 people. When the census takers came through in the years after the peace, they counted perhaps 100,000. The rest were dead, or fled, or simply gone in ways that no record could track, swallowed by a continent in motion, untethered from the places that had defined them. Think about every town, every village, every farm, every relationship, every tradition, every piece of accumulated human knowledge and craft that those missing people represented. Not lost in a moment, not taken in a single catastrophe, eroded, ground down, starved and diseased and killed and scattered over 30 years until the subtraction was so enormous it stopped feeling like a number and started feeling like a different kind of world. The generation that survived and remembered, the men and women in their 40s and 50s and 60s in 1648 who could tell you what it had been like before, were a minority in their own communities. They walked through landscapes they recognized, but that didn't recognize them back. Churches where they had been baptized stood roofless, their interiors open to the weather for years. The farms their fathers had worked were unrecognizable, reclaimed by vegetation, their boundaries lost, the legal records that proved ownership burned or scattered.
The social fabric, the web of relationships and obligations and community knowledge that makes a place rather than just a piece of ground, had been torn in ways that wouldn't be repaired for generations. And the children who had grown up entirely inside the war, born after 1618, who had never known a summer without the fear of armies, who had learned, before they learned anything else, that the world was dangerous and resources were scarce and trust was a luxury you couldn't afford. Those children were now adults.
They were the ones who would have to rebuild. They were the ones who would have to figure out how to plant fields they didn't own in soil depleted by years of neglect, how to re-establish the legal and commercial frameworks that had been destroyed, how to make peace with neighbors who had, in some cases, been on the other side of every alliance for as long as anyone could remember. They would do it. People do. Humans have this extraordinary, slightly terrifying capacity to absorb catastrophe and keep going. But they would do it carrying everything they had seen, everything they had survived, everything they had done to survive. There is a poem written in German shortly after the peace by Andreas Gryphius, a poet who had grown up during the war, whose family had been destroyed by it, who had watched his homeland devastated and rebuilt and devastated again across his entire childhood and adolescence. It is called Tears of the Fatherland. He describes a landscape of burned towers and churches, of rivers run dark with the residue of war, of plague and famine and the constant shrieking of cannon, of years devoured by flames. He ends with an image of something that the fire and the plague and the sword could not take, something internal, unnamed, that the war had stolen from inside people. Some essential thing, he implies, that doesn't have a name because it's only really visible in its absence.
What you can't see when you look at a survivor's face that you could see before.
He was describing the thing we now understand as collective trauma. He didn't have the vocabulary for it. He just knew it was gone. The world that emerged from the rubble of the 30 Years' War was genuinely new. Not new in the way that feels like a fresh start, new in the way that scar tissue is new. Different from what was there before, harder, less flexible, differently shaped. The Holy Roman Empire continued to exist, and would continue for another century and a half, but it existed now as a constellation of effectively sovereign states held together by a framework that everyone agreed was largely ceremonial. The age of the emperor as a genuine unifying political force in Central Europe was over. What replaced it was the beginnings of the modern state system. Independent nations, each with their own armies, their own bureaucracies, their own defined interests, interacting through diplomacy and the threat of force, rather than through the shared authority of emperor or pope. This is what historians mean when they say the Peace of Westphalia shaped the modern world. Not that it shaped it the way an architect designs a building, intentionally from a blueprint, but the way a geological event creates a landscape. By destroying what was there before, rearranging the underlying structure, and leaving behind a terrain that would shape everything built on top of it. The concept of sovereignty, the idea that a state has supreme authority within its own territory, and that other states are not entitled to interfere in its internal affairs, was not invented at Westphalia, but it was formalized there in ways that became the foundation of international law.
The nation-state, the balance of power. The idea of secular diplomacy as the mechanism for managing conflicts between states with different religions and different interests. All of it has roots that run back to those rooms in Osnabrück and Münster. That legacy is real, and it matters. But it should be held alongside another legacy that gets discussed less often. The 30 Years' War demonstrated something about human societies that is deeply uncomfortable to sit with. That a conflict can continue far past the point where anyone can articulate a coherent reason for it to continue. That the machinery of war, once fully constructed and set in motion, develops its own momentum, its own internal economy, its own logic of survival
that becomes entirely disconnected from the purposes that built it. That entire generations can be consumed by a conflict that started before their birth and will not end before their death, fighting for causes that have long since been transformed into something unrecognizable, sustaining a system that is destroying them because the alternative, stepping outside the system, is even more immediately dangerous. The people who rebuilt Central Europe in the decades after 1648 didn't do it because they had learned this lesson. They did it because they had no choice. They were alive, and the ground was there, and spring came again, as spring always comes, indifferent to everything humans have done to each other. Seeds were planted, timbers were raised, children were born into a world that was still scarred, but was, at least, quiet. The quiet that settled over Germany after the armies finally went home was a different kind of quiet from the one that followed an army's passage. It was not the quiet of erasure. It was the quiet of exhaustion, so complete it was almost indistinguishable from peace.
And slowly, over years, over decades, so slowly that no one alive at the time could see it happening, the forest began to give back the fields. New villages appeared where old ones had been. New names were given to places that had lost their names. New families put down roots in soil that held the bones of families they had never known. The accumulation of ordinary life, which is the most powerful force on earth, more powerful than any army, more durable than any ideology, began to fill in the outlines of what had been destroyed. But here is the thing that stays with you when you spend time inside this history. When you look at the population maps and the church records and the diaries and the poems and the blank pages where pastors couldn't find words, the thing that doesn't resolve into a lesson or a takeaway or a reason to feel better about what happened. All of it. Every village erased, every child orphaned, every field burned, every generation marked by what it had survived, was, at the start, somebody's act of faith, somebody's conviction that God was on their side, somebody's absolute certainty that the stakes were so high, the truth so clear, the enemy so wrong, that no cost was too great. The men who threw Martinique and Slavata from the window in Prague in 1618 believed they were acting for conscience and liberty. The men who crushed Magdeburg believed they were acting for the one true church. Gustavus Adolphus believed, without any apparent irony or doubt, that he was the instrument of divine providence. Ferdinand believed the same thing in the opposite direction. They all believed. The belief was not fake. The faith was not cynical, not in the beginning. It was real, and it was powerful, and it marched straight into 30 years of consequences that none of them foresaw, and none of them could stop. That is not a story about religion being dangerous, exactly. Or not only that. It is a story about what happens when absolute certainty, the certainty that you are right and your cause is just, and the scale of the stakes justifies everything, gets handed a sword and told to sort out the question of who God favors. It is a story about how causes that begin as genuine moral commitments can become the fuel for machinery that has long since stopped serving those commitments. About how the distance between the flag flying over an army and the reality of what that army is actually doing can grow over years into a chasm so wide that the flag becomes a kind of dark joke. There is a village in what is now Germany, in the region that was once most devastated by the war, where the local church still keeps a record, a simple list maintained by the parish of the names of every family that lived in that village before the war began. Beside each name, in a different hand, recorded later by whoever survived,
A notation. Gone. Dead. Unknown. Fled. Here and there, very occasionally, remained. The list is not very long. The remained column is very short. Somewhere in that short column, in that handful of names of people who lived through all of it, who held on through 30 years of everything the 17th century could throw at them, who were still there when the spring came back for good, is the whole story of what survival actually means. Not triumph, not vindication, not the satisfaction of having been on the right side of history, just still here, still breathing, standing in a world that had tried, methodically and repeatedly, to unmake them completely. Still here, with everything they had lost written in their faces, and everything they had kept compressed, like pressure under stone, somewhere behind their eyes. Still here. That's what they had. That's what 30 years of killing in the name of God left behind, when the killing finally, mercifully, exhausted itself. That was enough to build a world on. It had to be.